In the hearts of all mankind, of whatever race or station in life, there are inexpressible longings for something they do not now possess. This longing is implanted in the very constitution of man by a merciful God, that man may not be satisfied with his present conditions or attainments, whether good or bad. It is God's desire that this longing of the human heart should lead to the one who alone is able to satisfy it. Under the blessing of God, this book is given to the world with the prayer that the Lord, by His Spirit, will make the words of this book words of life to many souls, whose longings and desires are yet unsatisfied, that they may know Him and the power of His resurrection and the fellowship of His sufferings.
Ellen White was a prolific writer. For a woman in the 1800s, this was an incredible achievement. But what is perhaps even more amazing is that Ellen was able to write such powerful pieces at all. In 1909, when the division asked all their workers to fill out a biographical sheet, Ellen was asked, "What degrees, if any, have you received, and from what school or schools, and when?" Her answer? None.
At the age of 9, Ellen's education ended tragically when a rock thrown by a classmate struck her in the head. Reflecting on the injury, Ellen remarked,
"It was the hardest struggle of my young life,"
she wrote,
"to yield to my feebleness and decide that I must leave my studies and give up the hope of gaining an education."
Though she could no longer attend school, Ellen didn't stop learning. Over the course of her young life, she amassed a sizable library and allowed the different writing styles of each author to influence her own.
As Ellen began to travel and share the Advent message, her writing was further influenced by the experiences she had on the road. Before she left for Australia, several events inspired her renewed focus on the life of Christ.
The 1888 General Conference session in Minneapolis saw Adventist pastors and leaders passionately debating concepts of righteousness by faith. When the arguing became heated, Ellen was convinced that Adventists had lost sight of the meaning and power of salvation and sought to combat their legalism. Ellen and her assistants began to work on the 5 major books on the life of Christ: Thoughts from the Mount of Blessings, Desire of Ages, Christ Objects Lessons, and the first 100 pages of Ministry of Healing, and finally, Steps to Christ.
In 1890, there was a call from the literature evangelist and the pastors for Ellen to prepare a small book on salvation which could be easily transported and sold. She loved the idea, and together with her most prominent secretary, Marion Davis, the two combed through articles and sermons she'd written on the topic. By the time Ellen arrived in Australia, revised copies of Steps to Christ were delivered to their door. She and her secretaries were delighted to hear that there was a growing interest in the life of Christ, and Ellen felt even more strongly the need to complete a work which had been on her mind for some time.
Years before, whilst on a visit to Ohio, Ellen received a vision of the scenes of the age-old conflict between Christ and Satan. Much of the vision was transcribed in the first volume of Spiritual Gifts.
At Lovett's Grove, the Lord met with us, and His blessing rested upon us. When my husband closed his remarks, I felt urged by the Spirit of the Lord to bear my testimony. As I was led to speak upon the cheering hope of the Christian, I drank in rich draughts of salvation. Heaven, sweet heaven, was the magnet drawing my soul upward. I saw the first advent, the humiliation, the suffering, and finally the crucifixion of the Savior. Many in the congregation uttered audible sobs, announcing that their hearts were touched by the sufferings of the Son of God for rebellious man.
It was this vision and other like scenes which acted as a basis for both the Great Controversy and the Desire of Ages. But whilst the Great Controversy was intensely popular and narrated several important messages about the struggle between God and Satan, Ellen still felt there was a need to draw out the loving character of Christ, which she had witnessed. Elaborating on the vision, and some of her smaller works, she began to craft The Desire of Ages.
But finding time to write was not easy. Ellen's present was constantly in demand, and for a long time it seemed as if she would never be able to finish the book. Then, shortly after arriving in Australia, Ellen was stricken with pain and illness. She wrote,
I was unable to lift my feet from the floor without suffering great pain. My right arm from the elbow down was the only part of my body that was free from pain. Physicians said I would never be able to walk again. And I had fears that my life was to be a perpetual conflict and suffering. But in all this, there was my Savior, close beside me. I am so thankful that I had this experience, because I am better acquainted with my precious Lord and Savior.
Convinced by her illness that she must complete her work on the life of Christ while she was still able, Ellen set up a desk in the sunshine and began to write. Crafting several pages a day, sometimes before breakfast, Ellen compiled a large manuscript for the book, and with the help of Marion Davis, her secretary, the two pored over the drafts for errors. After many months, both were satisfied and the manuscript was sent to the Pacific Press for publication. On Saturday, the 10th of December, 1898, the first copy of the book Desire of Ages reached Kurrumbong, and the family rejoiced at the arrival, calling it an early Christmas gift. Finally, Ellen had completed the work she often called the pinnacle of her ministry.
Whilst in Australia, Ellen also completed Thoughts from the Mount of Blessings and Christ Object Lessons, and wrote many more diaries, letters and articles, which have guided the church and its members through some difficult times. This was a woman with limited education, who agonised about her difficulties expressing the wondrous things she'd seen. She faced countless barriers to her work and confessed that while writing The Desire of Ages, she felt that Satan was desperately trying to stop her. Yet despite all her limitations, the Australian writings speak to God's working in her life and a strength of character which echoes down through the ages.